epistemological duty to object. So the question I'm interested in is when, from an epistemic point of view, so when the normativity at issue is distinctively epistemic, meaning directed at truth or knowledge or understanding or some sort of distinctively epistemic goals. With that kind of normativity in mind, rather than, let's say, moral or pragmatic, when do we have the duty to object? Now, you'll see I'll touch on the moral and the practical throughout the discussion. But really, what I'm going to be focusing on is the distinctively epistemic dimension, because so little work has been done on it. So just to start off with one of the reasons we should care about the duty to object, George Orwell famously said, in times of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. So in one sense, I'm going to be looking at when are we obligated from an epistemic point of view to object to what we take to be false or unwarranted. So it does seem as though, just from kind of an intuitive point of view, that we have the duty to object to things that people say. And there seem to be, roughly speaking, at least two central forces of the normative force at work. I mean, if I know, for instance, that objecting to someone's claim that they saw you pull the trigger at the scene of the crime, obviously there's moral pressure for me to do so. If I know that that's false, that you weren't in fact there, for instance, you were out with me. Moral pressure because I can save you and the system from a grave injustice and you from distinctively moral harms. But there also seems to be truth-directed or knowledge-directed reasons to object. And that's really in large part what I'm going to be exploring today. So in the philosophical literature, specifically in the epistemological literature, there are two theses that have been so dominant in the literature that they really don't even go argued for. They're sort of tacit assumptions in the literature. And one of these theses I call the Dogsastic Thesis, and that's that epistemic duties, to the extent that we have them, concern only what we ought to believe. And so their domain is the strictly dogsastic or belief domain. Okay, so they don't extend beyond what we should believe. So for instance, you see titles of papers in the philosophical literature with the title, "There are no epistemic duties." And then the argument is that we can't be required to believe anything because we don't have voluntary control over our beliefs. So therefore, there are no epistemic duties. And you can see in an argument like that, the Dogsastic thesis is just a tacit premise. It doesn't even go argued for. It's if we cannot be required to believe things because we don't have voluntary control over our beliefs, then there are no epistemic duties. Another thesis that's widely accepted is the intrapersonal thesis, and that's that epistemic duties concern only our own life, our own dogsastic life, and so their domain is importantly intrapersonal. This sort of falls out of, I mean, not necessarily, but it is, I mean, you can see it as dropping out of sort of naturally from the Dogsastic thesis. If the domain of our epistemic duties is limited in scope to what we ought to believe, then it follows rather naturally that the domain would be over our own, believings, so to speak. I'm going to be looking at, that's the kind of the background of what I'm going to be engaging with. I'm going to be looking at, again, when we should be objecting. So just to kind of give us a little bit of a clear idea of what I have in mind with an objection, I'm understanding them as assertions that are added to a conversational context with the aim of correcting the record. I'm going to tweak that correcting the record you're going to see as we go on, because really what these objections are doing, what these assertions are doing, are adding to the evidential base, okay? But oftentimes when we are objecting, we're objecting to what we take to be false or unwarranted. So we either think that it's a false claim or we think that it's an kind of unjustified claim. And so the aim is to kind of correct that. They don't, in order to have a successful objection, it doesn't require acceptance, the way I'm understanding them. And I'm focusing specifically on objections that target the propositional content of an assertion. We can imagine objections that target the way something was said, how it was said, where it was said, but I'm going to be putting those aside. I think a lot of what I say today would extend naturally to those cases anyway. Now, here's a thesis we might consider, right? Object to everything you take to be false or unwarranted, right? That's what we're obligated to do, right? Every time you hear someone say something false, every time you hear someone say something that doesn't have appropriate, evidential base, you're obligated to object. One worry with this kind of what we might think is a very natural, kind of an easy thesis, right? Then we would just be ready to go home. That's when we're obligated to object, is what we might call an over-demandingness objection. And so Liam Murphy, very nicely says there's, a limit to how great a sacrifice morality can legitimately demand of agents. This is a very well-known objection to consequentialism in ethics. We can't just be required to always maximize, good outcomes, happiness or well-being. Because that places too demanding of a constraint on us. We have our own projects, we have our own commitments. And I think by now, in a parallel fashion would say, there has to be a limit to how great a sacrifice epistemology can demand of its agents. And so it does seem like we have to have sort of in the background of this, worrying that epistemology would be requiring us to in a way do nothing other than object, especially in the world that we live in, where all we have to do is log on and we probably encounter, 20 immediate things we should object to. So in order to kind of narrow down the scope of this duty to object that I'm going to be interested in, I want to start by highlighting two features. And I'm just going to kind of provide some minimal support on behalf of these features. And then as we go on, I think some of the arguments I provide will provide additional support. So first, it seems that one's duty to object can be directly influenced by whether others object, especially those who are in the same sort of conversation or the same sort of context. Now, one of the reasons this is really interesting is that when we think about the duty to object, let's think about it, let's kind of compare it or contrast it with other duties that we might have. So I'm going to pick a moral one and an epistemic one. So promise keeping, right? We have a duty, we have an obligation to keep our promises. But it doesn't look like whether or not we're obligated to keep our promise depends in any way on whether others keep their promise. If, three of us, promise to visit you in the hospital on Wednesday, it doesn't matter whether I'm obligated to visit you in the hospital on Wednesday if my two friends visit you in the hospital on Wednesday. Sure, if they keep their promise and I don't, you might be less sad because at least you have someone there, but it doesn't get me off of the moral hook of, the obligation I have to keep my promise. And let's just assume, some people are going to agree with this and some people aren't, but let's just assume that it's an epistemic obligation that we should believe in accordance with the evidence. Again, it doesn't matter whether you're believing in accordance with the evidence in terms of my duty to believe in accordance with the evidence. Even if I accept your, I form my belief on the basis of your testimony, it still matters whether I'm believing on the basis of evidence that supports your testimony. And so one of the reasons why this is interesting about the duty to object is that it seems unlike other paradigmatic duties, both on the moral and the epistemic side, which don't seem to be influenced by whether others object. So let's consider a case. Suppose that we're all in a conversation and someone says that the restaurant in town, Thai Suk Di, closes at 10. And that in fact that it closes at 11. And John, who's standing next to you, objects that no, Thai Suk Di closes at 11. It seems as though there's no reason why you would need to object as well, right? The fact that John objected seems sufficient for correcting the record in that conversation. And so whether or not you have the duty to object seems impacted by what John just did. If he had failed to say anything, then it seems as though you should have stepped in and done something. And so that's supposed to just be some kind of an intuitive difference. I'm going to draw some, I'm going to give a diagnosis as to why I think these duties are different in just a minute. Another feature of the duty object that seems to be different from other classic duties like promise keeping on the moral side and believing in accordance with the evidence on the epistemic side is that one's duty to object seems to be directly influenced by one's social status. And by social status, I'm going to be including a fair bit. I'm going to be including things like, profession, expertise, and also sort of things that we might think of as more classically as social status, such as race or gender. If there's a hate crime on my campus, it seems as though the president of the university, there's greater normative pressure for him to object than there is for me to object. And one of the reasons for that is the president's social status. He has a position of authority within the university, and it seems as though the normative pressure to say something can depend on one's social situatedness in various ways. That's just one example, but I think we can think of a lot of others. So there was a study done in 2016 that I think kind of bears this out. I'm obviously speaking specifically from a normative point of view, but I think this study has some interesting connections with what we're looking at. So the study from 2016 looked at the impact of calling out racist harassment online via Twitter. And it used bots to object to harassers, and it varied their identities not only by in-group and out-group, so a white man versus a black man membership, but also by the number of Twitter followers each bot has. And what the study found was that subjects who were sanctioned by high follower white males significantly reduced the use of racist slurs, leading to the title of this article in The Atlantic, Why Online Allies Matter in Fighting Harassment. A clever experiment with Twitter bots shows that telling people not to be racist can work, but only if it comes from someone influential and white. And in the same article, the author quoted a psychologist from Princeton who said, there's a reason why higher status members of these communities bear a larger share of the responsibility for speaking out against racist or bigoted speech. This isn't just a moral judgment, but an empirical regularity that's been coming out of many research programs. People with higher status are influencing norms, and with that influence comes responsibility. If anyone says, I'm not a role model, that's a wish and not a fact. And so one of the things that we see in the Munger experiment is that people with higher status, along many dimensions, I would have, it seems like, greater impact. So if we're looking at this in terms of impact, then it does seem as though social status can bear on responsibility. Now, I just want to immediately, address a potential worry one might have. This is not suggesting that only kind of higher status people ought to be part of the conversation. It's saying that someone with a higher status has the duty to do something. And if someone with a lower social status, for instance, were to object, that would be going above and beyond. It'd be supererogatory and certainly would be welcome, but would not be something that is necessarily obligatory, given various contexts. Obviously, this is a contextual claim. So these two theses that I'm calling others and social status, as I suggested, point to a fundamental difference between a duty like promise keeping or believing on the basis of evidence, and one like objecting. And I think at least part of the reason is that objecting seems to be deeply social in a way that promise keeping and believing in accordance with the evidence isn't. And so I want to kind of explore this in a little bit more detail. So one parallel that I think is really very telling and I think ends up being sort of theoretically rich to consider is with the duty of charity. And so, it's kind of widely argued in the ethics literature that we have the duty to be charitable, perhaps by donating to the poor or various other ways that we might engage in charitable giving. But it's obviously affected very clearly by what others are doing and by our social status. For instance, if everybody is donating to a family, kind of in town who recently lost a lot in a fire, it seems as though my obligation to give there might diminish and maybe I should give elsewhere. Whereas if nobody is, then it looks like maybe I should kind of step up and help this family, that maybe my efforts would be best put into that context. And certainly it seems as though our social status matters. Certainly in terms of, I mean, we might think that, Mark Zuckerberg has more of an obligation to engage in charitable giving than I do, for instance. Now, one explanation for the similarity between the duty to object and the duty to be charitable is that we might think that both involve, in a very important sense, limited goods. So even for people who have enormous wealth, for instance, there is still, the goods are still limited. There's not an infinite amount to go around. And similarly, we might think that our voices, right, our ability to effectively object is a limited good. We don't have an infinite number of them. I'm sure many people have been at a department meeting where in a way they're like, I'm just not going to fight that battle, right? I mean, I don't want to be objecting all the time. I'm just going to let that one go and sort of store up my objection, so to speak, for when it really matters. And one of the reasons for this is we might think that like the efficacy, kind of having effective objections is a limited good that we have. But also connecting up with what we said earlier, we all don't have the same number of them, right? Some of us have a lot more because of our social situatedness than others. Some people are much more likely to be silenced or drowned out or ignored than others. And so just like we, kind of have different sort of amounts of wealth, we also have different amounts, if we're thinking about this sort of quantitatively, of effective objections. So I just kind of said that. So I think that what I've been saying thus far has, I hope, just been suggestive that there's these dissimilarities between the duty to object and to keep promises or to believe in accordance with the evidence. And there are similarities between the duty to object and to be charitable. And I think that this points to a potentially deeper explanation. So classically, promise keeping is regarded as a perfect, what's called in the literature, a perfect duty, while charity is an imperfect one. And so what I want to explore is whether first the duty to object can be understood as an imperfect one in this way. And second, if it follows from this, that in addition to imperfect moral duties, there are imperfect epistemic ones. So one of the things to highlight for those who are not kind of well-versed in this literature is that people don't talk about there being imperfect epistemic duties. It's something that's distinctively reserved for the moral domain. So one of the contributions that I'm trying to make in this paper is first to give an analysis of the duty to object, but also for there to be a broader conclusion, namely that there can be imperfect epistemic duties in addition to moral ones. So at the heart of the notion of an imperfect duty, so these are paradigmatically things like charity, mercy, gratitude, beneficence, and so on, is the idea that discretion and latitude are allowed in their fulfillment. So this is a paper, I don't know why I don't have the author's name, but it's Andrew Schroeder. And he gives, I think, a really nice characterization of this notion of latitude that is at work in imperfect duties. So an account of imperfect duty should specify the duty in aid, and I'll say what he means there in a minute, and relevantly similar cases, so as to make it in some respect less onerous than the duty in rescue, allowing agents some kind of discretion. So what he's suggesting here is that there's a very important difference. He wants to say, now, as with many things, in academic philosophy, this is not accepted by everyone, but it's widely accepted that there is a normative difference, morally speaking, from the duty that you have if you're walking past a shallow pond with a drowning toddler in it, and it would take very little effort on your part to kind of, walk into the shallow pond and save the toddler, even if you were to ruin your expensive outfit doing so. That the duty to do that is sort of greater or stronger or different than the duty that there is to take that same amount of money that you would spend, that you would lose on the outfit and send it to charity. Now, this has been challenged. I mean, some people say, like, what is the difference? Is it proximity? It can't be just that proximity to the problem. So I'm not suggesting that there are no questions here, but it is widely agreed that there'd be something kind of morally monstrous about walking past the the pond and not saving the toddler despite the expensive outfit, in a way that there's not in taking that same amount and sending it to a charitable organization that would save lives. And what Schroeder is saying here with latitude is that an account of imperfect duties needs to capture this, right? Because it seems as though there is really an important difference between the kind of duty in rescue, which is saving the child, the drowning child, and aid, giving aid through, a charitable organization. So charity, to kind of follow this through, might require that I donate to the poor, but it certainly doesn't specify to whom or how much. In fact, some people have even understood imperfect duties as being disjunctive in nature, that their very nature is disjunctive, meaning that it's, donate X amount once a month to Oxfam, or blah, blah, blah to, another organization, or blah, blah, blah. And that literally the nature of the duty itself is disjunctive, but, we don't need to take that on board. So one thing to keep in mind is that, even an imperfect duty can become perfect. So it might be the case that I don't, in general, I have this imperfect duty to engage in charitable giving, where there's a lot of latitude, but at a particular moment, if, giving $5 to someone would save someone's life, then it can become a perfect duty in that context. So another feature of imperfect duties is that an account should say what distinguishes imperfect from perfect duties in a way that explains why it's frequently possible to do more than what an imperfect duty requires and why it still has moral value. Now, obviously, this is relativized to the moral domain. If we're talking about the epistemic normativity, then it would be the epistemic domain. But here's what this criterion is saying. If I keep more and more of my promises, I don't have an excess of moral goodness or an excess of moral praise. I'm just doing the minimum of what I should do, right? I mean, I'm just keeping my promises. But if I give a lot of money to charity, then it seems as though I'm doing additional moral work and it has extra value to do so. We might know, I know of some graduate students who have committed to donating, 20% of their stipend, and that seems additionally praiseworthy. We might also think that, people who, engage in very hard work with objecting are also going above and beyond, right? We might probably all know people in our context. For instance, sometimes these are people who are very vulnerable members of our communities, people who are graduate students or untenured faculty members who shoulder a lot of the epistemic and moral load when it comes to objecting to misogyny or racism or sexism or harassment in a profession and so on. And in these cases, we might think that just like with charitable giving, it's not that they're doing, kind of what's, kind of the bare minimum, but that they're doing additional work, additional epistemic and moral work, and that excess has additional normative value. And that's unlike a perfect duty like promise keeping or believing in accordance with the evidence. If many of your beliefs are based on good evidence, we wouldn't be like, wow, you're really going above and beyond the epistemic, kind of call there. So I think that the duty to object fits really nicely within this framework. So there's clearly latitude involved in its satisfaction. And this brings us back to the point that I said at the very beginning about over-demandingness. We don't think that someone is necessarily criticizable if they don't object to everything on Facebook or everything on Twitter or everything, kind of in the department meeting with which they disagree. In fact, I think that many of us would think that that's kind of ineffective, that it's not really fulfilling the moral and epistemic aims that we think objecting or, kind of correcting the record ought to be doing. And so it seems like there's some latitude, and latitude can be determined in a lot of different ways. Some people really become very committed to certain issues. Like I was talking about some members of our various professions who have taken on a lot of the burden of objecting to, kind of misogyny or sexism or racism. It can also be, in different contexts. Some people might object more in particular conversations, but not on social media, for instance. But just like there seems to be latitude with respect to our charitable giving, there seems to be latitude with respect to our objecting. And I think that this lends itself to the duty to object very nicely fitting within the imperfect duty framework. And I want to mention that, for those of you new to this perfect imperfect duty distinction, this is not a standard. In fact, I don't know of anyone who has brought the duty to object under this umbrella, because typically we think about these duties as, like I said, being distinctively well, first of all, moral, but also as being like sort of the classic charity beneficence ones. And so to the extent that we think that this duty can fall under this umbrella, that's in a way a kind of a substantive, framework shift. And I think that we can also easily envisage aid and rescue versions of the duty to object. We might even think of extending some of the language that in general, our duty is to provide epistemic aid to others. And so, we ought to be kind of, throwing out like epistemic life rafts, right? Like when we see someone who we think is kind of really like fumbling in the dark, either through ignorance or misinformation, or in the grips of a conspiracy theory, then we might think that like we have some latitude in when to give epistemic aid. But sometimes we are in contexts in which we need to engage in epistemic rescues, where the stakes are so high that it's kind of on a par with like a drowning child. It's an epistemic version of that, where believing this falsehood has so much potential for damage with respect to understanding or knowledge or truth on the epistemic side, or with respect to justice and harm on the moral side, for instance, that the imperfect duty to object becomes a perfect duty to give to kind of engage in an epistemic rescue. And, again, with respect to how imperfect duties, you can do more. I already suggested this early on, but that's another way in which it fits really nicely within this framework, that you can engage in more objections and that has additional value, unlike perfect duties. Okay, so I think that we have reasons for affirmative answers to both of our earlier questions, that the framework of imperfect duties can be useful in understanding the duty to object, particularly when we keep in mind that over-demandingness constraint with which we began, and also that if it makes sense to think of the duty to object as being an imperfect epistemic one, then we have reason to draw the general conclusion that there are some imperfect epistemic duties. I think that it's an open question what additional ones. I have some thoughts and happy to go over those in the Q&A, but I certainly don't think this is the only one. Now, I want to spend the remaining minutes of my time thinking a little bit more about how to understand this. Now, I really do think you can take on board everything that I've said up until this point and still reject what I'm going to say from this point onward. And I highlight that because while I really like this framework, I don't think that you have to take on board the direction that I'm going to be going in now. I find this framework very useful. And I also do a lot of work on the epistemology of groups and the epistemology of collective entities. And so I find this framework very useful. And also, I think that it captures some of the desiderata with respect to the duty object very, very nicely. But it is separable from the first half of the discussion. So one way of understanding imperfect duty simpliciter, so just imperfect duties in general, is in collective terms. And this is not like a super widely accepted way of thinking about them, but Liam Murphy has done a really nice job of fleshing out this view. And so the way he understands imperfect duties in the moral literature is that they first and foremost belong to groups rather than to individual agents. And so what this means is that on this duty, the duty to engage in charitable giving is one that's directed at us collectively as a community or a society. So the way he understands this is that the duty is a collective one, and each member of that collective has a share of the responsibility. And our share is determined by what, for him, on what would best, most promote the good. So he's, it's broadly a consequentialist framework. And so think about the fact that there are like many different communities. So it's not just that there's just one us. So let's just take like, my institution, I'm a professor at Northwestern University. So that's a community. So that community has a collective duty to object to assertions with propositional content that bear on, let's say, the events and mission and, goals and the goings on, so to speak, of the Northwestern community. And so the duty to object is something that falls on the university as a whole, on the community. And then each community member has a different share of satisfying that goal. Okay. Now, a central advantage of this conception of, he specifically fleshes out the imperfect duty of beneficence, but it's supposed to be a general framework, is that he thinks that it provides the resources for responding to a classic objection to consequentialism, and that's the over-demandingness of it. You know what, I'm going to skip the slide. It really gets into too much detail. If any of you are interested in this, I'm happy to go over it. In a nutshell, Murphy includes what he calls the compliance condition in his account. I think it has some very serious problems. I end up rejecting the compliance condition and then take on board the cooperative, the sort of the collective picture more generally. So if you want to hear about that during the Q&A, I'm happy to, but I really don't think that we need to go into that to get the gist of what I'm saying. So groups or collectives, as I said, can be understood very broadly and heterogeneously. And I also want to just mention that even if the duty to object is understood as a collective one, this doesn't mean that there are not also individual duties. I mean, here's just a very clear example. Individual duties might be generated, for instance, by particular relationships. So even if, a lot of people have objected to a false claim and it's essentially been corrected. If it's about like a close friend or colleague or family member, I might have an additional duty to object. That's like clearly morally motivated, but I think that there are epistemic versions of this as well. So I just want to highlight, I'm not suggesting that there are no individual duties. Okay. So what is the advantage of the duty to object being understood as a collective one? So one of the things that is helpful here is that it explains why what other members of the community are doing can matter, right? So much to what I'm doing. So one thing, let me see. I just want to see if I had a slide on this. I don't think I have a slide on this, so I'll go over this just now. So one thing that we might think is when is the objection effective? Like when do we need to stop objecting? And so I gave the example before of a restaurant closing, and someone else objects, and that sort of discharges my duty, right? I don't have to say anything because the record's sort of been corrected. No one's objecting. It's like, oh, it stays open till 11. I was there last night and it was open till 11. And it's not as though like I then need to object as well. So is one objection like that always sufficient? And I want to say no. What we need to look at is how resistant to counter evidence the claim in question is. And that will determine kind of what sort of epistemic pushback is needed. So a claim like Tai Suk D stays open till 10 is not very resistant to counter evidence. So one objection within the conversational context or within the community is sufficient for our duty to object to have been discharged. But obviously, there are all sorts of claims around conspiracy theories, claims grounded in kind of racism and hate and bias and prejudice, a lot of claims like this that are highly resistant to counter evidence. And so those sorts of claims are going to be such that one member of the conversational context might not be sufficient for the duty to be discharged. So one of the reasons why, I just wanted to kind of flag that. So one of the reasons why understanding the duty to object as a collective one is useful is helping us understand this interpersonal dynamic between what someone else does and how it impacts me. Why is it the case that when someone else in my, my context objects, that's sufficient, that's, kind of discharges my duty? Well, one of the reasons is because it's our duty and we each have a share to do. And, that person objecting in the conversational context discharged our duty to object. Now, what is each of our share? So remember that Murphy's conception of a moral imperfect duty. He understood the duty to object, the share being determined by what would most maximize the good. It just is in a classic consequentialist way. But going back to what we said earlier, I think that we need to connect up the duty to object with also the resources that people have. And so, if you recall, I said at the very beginning that just as people have, kind of different amounts of wealth and material goods, so too people have different kind of amounts, so to speak, of being able to effectively object. And so how much someone has to do, how much labor, sort of epistemic labor they need to take on is going to be connected up on this view with how much they have. So we're going to be looking at the distribution of the goods that people have, the epistemic goods like expertise, authority, traction within the community, these sorts of things. And that's going to determine how much someone needs to object. And so how much of the share of the collective duty someone's going to need to take on. I think that's fine. So on this view, we can understand the duty to object as being a collective one, one where each member's individual share of the responsibility is determined in large part by the distribution of goods, so especially social and epistemic statuses, and two, whether the other members of the collective do their share. And this is, I didn't go into this in too much detail because this really connects up with the compliance condition that Liam Murphy includes in his account and that I reject. So I actually think that the kind of interpersonal connectedness of social communities absolutely determines how much share people need to do. And that's something that Murphy explicitly wanted to reject. He wanted to say that we carve up shares and that's all you have to do. It doesn't matter if other people are doing their share or not. You only have to do your share. There are immediate problems that arise with this that he himself knows. So if there are 2 drowning children, for instance, and I run down and save one and then come upstairs and start reading a book while the other child drowns, I have no moral, not even a moral tug of normativity to go back and save that second child because that's your share and I don't have to pick up your share. And I think I think that's just a really counterintuitive consequence. I think he thinks so too. And so that's one of the reasons why I include too, that whether the other members of a collective are doing their share can directly impact how much objecting people need to do. So I put this in general terms, but the specific epistemic version of the duty would restrict the goods and statuses in question to only those with epistemic significance. So when I was talking on the previous slide here, I just was talking in general about the distribution of goods. And that would be, kind of the all things considered duty to object. That would include epistemic, moral, practical normativity. But if we're interested specifically in the epistemic version, then we would restrict those. Notice that I say that 1 and 2 largely determine the individual shares of the collective duty to object. I'm not suggesting that this is exhaustive. I think that there might be other factors that determine. One might be stakes, for instance. My duty to object might be sensitive to the potential harms at issue, both epistemic and moral. So just to kind of wrap up, I argued that we have the epistemic duty to object to what we take to be false or unwarranted, and that this duty can be helpfully understood as imperfect in nature. And if you're on board with me with that, then we can conclude that generally speaking, there are imperfect epistemic duties, including in addition to perfect ones. I think that there's a useful framework that we can take on board where the duty belongs to communities and other collectives. And that this shows how responsibility can be distributed at both the group and the individual levels, which is a very common problem in the collective epistemology literature, but also just like collective responsibility. There's a lot of there's a difficulty in being able to adequately address how there's a tendency to either foist all responsibility onto the group itself and then to leave individual members wholly blameless, or to leave the group completely blameless and then to foist all of the individual responsibility on individual members. And I think that this framework where there are individual shares, but a collective duty, can help us have a theoretical framework for distributing that responsibility, I think, across both group level, across both the group level and the individual level. So I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Lackey for her wonderful talk. Thank you.